Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 5 of In the Fire Garden. Today I'm joined with John Belk. He is an associate professor of English at Southern Utah University and the author of The Gardens of Our Childhoods, right here, from Autumn House Press, winner of the 2021 Autumn House Press Rising Writer Prize. His poems and scholarship have appeared in various journals and anthologies, and his chapbook, The Weathering of Igneous Rock Formations in High Altitude Riparian Environments, is available from Cathexis Northwest, and he lives in Cedar City, Utah, under the loving shade of a giant blue spruce. John, thank you for taking the time to come visit today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, what's before we get into the reading, I think that your book is awesome for a number of reasons. One, it won the Rising Writer Prize, which is a pretty incredible start to your poetic career. We'll say as a debut. Has that opened a lot of like opportunities and opened some doors? And what's been your experience of like after post publication with that?
No, it's been an absolute dream come true, and Autumn House was a dream press of mine ever since I did my MFA at Penn State, and Autumn House is in Pittsburgh, and so that was when I first was introduced to them, and I just fell in love with a lot of the poets and writers that were on that press. And so it's always been a dream press. And when they called and said that I won the Rising Writer Prize, I was just blown away. I'd been submitting to them for probably 6 or 7 years, and yeah, it was mind boggling. And then when Poets and Writers decided to spotlight the book, it was kind of a second dream come true, because that was it was the first magazine that I ever personally subscribed to, and so it's been a bit of a whirlwind, and I'm still a little speechless from it. But yeah, it's been amazing.
And the book was selected by Matthew Dickman, and he has a blurb in the book. He says of it, in The Gardens of Our Childhoods, John Belk transfers the bard's comment that all the world's a stage, from the theater stage to the comic, violent, vulnerable, and the wild ring of WrestleMania. This is a book of searching, tender, open moments. Life is beautiful, but not without its dangers. Belk knows this is true and does a fine job guiding us down the garden path. And what makes this book so cool and unexpected when I opened it and read it is it's a wrestling book. It's a poetry book, but tons of wrestling in there. Are so you are a big wrestling fan then?
Yeah, so I was a huge fan of wrestling growing up. I watched it, all through my childhood. When I actually left for graduate school, I kind of quit watching it for a while. I got busy and just didn't really have much time for it. And then when I moved to Cedar, there are a few professors here who are kind of big wrestling fans, and so we would hang out and watch wrestling again, and it rekindled my love for it. And at the time, I was working on that chapbook that you mentioned, which is really a chapbook about self harm and the various kind of literal and metaphorical ways that we self harm. And I was working on that, and I was hanging out with this crew watching wrestling, and it kind of re-sparked my love for it. And I thought, like, what better way to kind of look at toxic masculinity and self harm and the ways that those interconnect than through professional wrestling and through these kind of big muscle bound guys who kind of both inhabit this kind of toxicity and violence, but also it's also theater, and it's kind of sweet in so many ways. And so yeah, it made so much sense. It was just a perfect confluence there.
So getting back into it, have you kind of like caught yourself up on the storylines and everything going on right now, or do you kind of know what's going on?
A bit. I've actually been watching AEW a bit more than WWE. I quit watching WWE about a year or two ago, and I've been following AEW off and on, more on than off lately, but yeah, so um yeah, I've been having a lot of fun with that.
So before uh, asking you to read from some selections from your book for us, I figured since there is so much wrestling in the book that I'll kind of steal from a very famous wrestling podcast uh, from Stone Cold the Broken Skull, and we'll lead into the reading with some rapid fire questions. I won't time it, but I'll just ask you real quick, pretty much this or that, and we'll go pretty quick here.
Let's
Favorite
go for it.
favorite wrestler of all time.
Um, Scott Hall.
Favorite finisher of all time.
Oh, the Stone Cold Stunner.
What's the best match you've ever seen?
Oh, Undertaker throwing Mankind off the cell.
That's a good one because that's my next question is what's the best Undertaker phase that he's had?
Oh, the only phase I didn't really like that much was the American Badass phase. Everything else, like all of the old school Undertaker, though, I'm completely on board.
So retro time, WCW or WWF when they were concurrent with each other.
WCW.
I felt that actually. AEW or New Japan.
Oh, that's a hard one. I'm going to say AEW just because that's what I've been following more lately, but that's purely circumstance.
Not necessarily a bigger event, but your more personal favorite than WrestleMania or Wrestle Kingdom.
WrestleMania.
The Young Bucks or the New Day.
Young Bucks.
Vintage
question.
question.
Oh, actually, no. Let me retract that. New Day.
I do love the New Day. Vintage. Hardy Boys or Dudleys.
Ooh, equivalent.
Sting or Goldberg.
A Sting.
I was always a Sting guy too.
Yeah.
Hogan or Cena.
Cena.
What's your favorite wrestling pay-per-view event?
SummerSlam.
Okay, I do like SummerSlam. Bret Hart or HBK?
Oh. HBK.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved HBK. What do you think is the best looking title belt there's ever been?
Big gold. Big gold all the way.
Yeah, I especially loved Batista with that one.
Yeah.
Who's the best wrestling movie star?
Batista.
I do think he's the best one. Best wrestling movie.
Oh, what was the one with Hulk Hogan? He's like Space Commando, dude. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of that one either, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go with that one just because I like cheesy camp.
And now, last one: best wrestling book.
Oh, ooh. I don't know. I have no good answer on that one.
My vote is going to be this one.
Well, I will take it. Oh man, there's so many good ones. That's so hard. Not a fair question. All right.
But we'll segue into your book then, if you are okay with reading some selections for us here.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll start with it's the second poem in the book. Perry Saturn makes ends meet after a failed tour with New Japan Pro Wrestling. And I knew when I set out to write the book, I had like 3 or 4 Perry Saturn poems that kind of came out all at once. And I knew I wanted that to be kind of the engine of the book. Perry Saturn was always one of my favorite wrestlers. I'd say Scott Hall's probably my favorite, but Perry Saturn's, they're pretty close. And the thing I like about Perry Saturn is there's just this period of time where he kind of fell into substance abuse and fell out of the public kind of I don't know, limelight or whatever. And it kind of gave me some room to fictionalize some stuff with this. And so I was kind of trying to imagine like what was he doing um, during this kind of period of time where he fell off the map, basically. Um, and so yeah, Perry Saturn makes ends meet after a failed tour with New Japan Pro Wrestling. In the solar fields past Barstow, Perry collects birds. Every morning, stemmed and unconcerned, he wears a welder's apron and work boots, walks among panels 2 hours at a time, scooping remains of avian frames caught between tower and ground. He smells of cedar and earth, pungent body oil and leather and salt. Each bird is a cloud at the edge of apocalypse, carbon black, lit with fire. Perry scoops them into buckets, carries them off. Each one, he thinks, is a sorry metaphor. Perry takes lunch on a support girder of Ivanpah Solar Tower 2, carefully unwraps a dry turkey club with tomato. The plant powers 2 telescopes and half the Golden Valley. Underground are solenoids and valves, tanks of molten salt that store the sun. This is what a star looks like up close. Perry puts the remains of a California gull in his bucket. One of its eyes is still knowable, its burnt breast wearing the bulk of its trauma. For a moment, he wants to return it to the beach, dip it in the soft Pacific, and be forgiven for breaking his mother's heart. He shakes the thought. In a bathroom that smells of cooked meat and acetone, he re-ups and daydreams of high school and a time when he wasn't lonely, and stardust and beach grit and flight and some far-off future, some other world of swirling color and undivided light. And so I think the other piece of that poem too is if you drive south on I-15 past Vegas, um, and kind of toward Barstow, you'll see all of these solar fields with those giant reflective towers. And one of the things that I've always thought was interesting about those is the way that they store that energy that they collect from all of those solar panels is underneath the ground. There are these giant tanks of molten salt. And it's like a giant battery basically, and they're buried underground, and so it holds that heat and energy, and so then they can use it to spin turbines to provide electricity for a lot of kind of Southern California basically. But the other interesting thing about that is those big reflective towers reflect so much heat toward the solar panels that they explode birds that fly in between. And so they have to hire people to go and pick up these kind of charred, exploded birds that fly too low and in between these reflected sunbeams, basically. So that's kind of where all of that poem came from. And yeah.
I'm glad you explained that, because driving past that, once I got there, I knew they were solar fields, but every time I trick myself into thinking like, is that like a lake or something out there? Because it looks like a mirage as you're driving there.
That's why the birds think it's a lake too, and so birds will fly down. They're not great for birds. They're really sustainable energy, but they're not great for birds because birds think it's a lake too, and then they.
Yeah, those poor birds. I didn't know that.
Okay. So, one of the other kind of through lines of the book is obviously mothers. I did a word cloud of the book at one point, and that was by far the most common word in the book was mother. And so this is the first poem where I really kind of deal with mothers and sons, and mothers come in kind of hardcore, but it's also the first poem where I really kind of deal with death and suffering, and I think that that's part of wrestling too. I mean, it's theater, it's burlesque, but that's part of what's fun about it is there's this kind of there's this this through line of suffering, both in reality. Wrestlers obviously have all kinds of substance abuse problems and things like that, but also just in the storylines, right? Betrayal and um, uh, backstabbing, that kind of stuff. So anyway, this is the death of Owen Hart. Here was a man beloved. Even the worst in the business mourned for Owen Hart. If a man has enemies in life, they are often buried by death. But Owen made genuine sorrow grow from the most hard packed of soil. I was a melancholy boy for sure, but loved, so I suppose I relate. It seems that life is a pity's wheel for losing, especially for melancholy boys, losing coins, loved ones, a thimble of resolve. I lost my language once, drunk. I lost lovers no more or less than most, and friends. When I was very small, I lost a tin man in the dirt beneath my mother's favorite tree. How much have I lost, and how? Sitting in my garden, shoveling turnips into buckets for the winter. And how should I mourn? One more fallen, stunted, rolled aside to the fallow edge where stone becomes grass, and beyond, a host of mothers singing, their voices carried in endless open fields. I'll do a short one here. This is a sonnet, and it's another Perry Saturn poem, and it's probably one of my favorite poems in the book. So, if not my favorite. Perry Saturn fell in love with a mop. And if you're familiar with Perry Saturn's career, he had a gimmick for a while when he went to WWE where he had a girlfriend named Moppy that was a mop with a painted kind of lipstick face on. And he was very attached to this mop. And of course, his rivals would kidnap the mop. And eventually, it ended up with the mop getting put through a tree chipper, which is terrible. And he was very sad. So Perry Saturn fell in love with a mop. Perry bought a pair of linen curtains too long to dress the sliding glass door. He thought he was in love with them. He once loved a turtle, a fish, the ocean on its side when it was sleeping. He loved a girl, a few even, but never like the first. He loves better now. Still, there are breaths we cannot keep. Another heart opens for a time, and we bathe soft in another life, tangled in curtains, carmine tressed and a tart curl of lip, oyster freckled, happy. We dance with a painted mop head like an ancient fool, a wrestler, a well-dressed open glass door inviting us into the day. Do you have a preference for one that you want to hear?
Ooh, yeah. Thank you for asking. There's a lot that stand out to me. So I was gonna. What are some things ones I ask a question about? There are. I really actually love because I have some questions about this one in particular as it relates to maybe the whole of the book, but incantation.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, and that one's a fun kind of weird one. It was originally going to be the opening poem. Um, I wanted to kind of open the poem, or I wanted to open the book with a space for breath, or like almost like a blessing, just like this kind of space of peace. And so that was what this poem was. And then when we were going through the revision process, Mike Good at Autumn House, who was just a fantastic developmental editor with this, suggested that I move around some of the poems to kind of help people notice the connections and teach them how to read the book. And so this poem got pushed back a few instead of being the opening poem. But yeah, it's reflective of the fact that I was a classics major as an undergraduate, and still a lot of my research is in ancient rhetoric and poetry, and so it draws on a lot of Greek myth, obviously. So incantation, Fraxinus ornis, which is of course the biological name for the ash tree, which is the tree that is the mythological Yggdrasil, the bones of the world, basically. So incantation. In this ring I rest under a moment of cloud. The Melii were born of the blood that fell on Gaia when Cronus castrated Uranus. They nursed the infant Zeus, feeding him goat's milk and honey. Some say the spine of the world is an ash, Yggdrasil, a Puritan prayer and a garden somewhere, a mountain, a mother, a father and a boy, a fight, and a hope that you're okay. And so I think the other thing with that poem was I was just trying to go very broad, like almost kind of mythological impressionist painting, with like broad strokes of color to kind of set the again to open up this kind of breath, this prayer of a space for the rest of the book to kind of inhabit. So yeah, that's where that poem really came from, and then obviously it kind of connected into all of the wrestling stuff, just with fighting and violence and all of that. Did that answer your question about that poem?
Yeah, it did. It did a little bit because actually, it was the same style that I thought that his advice to you was. I read incantation as kind of a code for the rest of the book. That it helps kind of code our way of reading the book. That the it basically codes for us that there's a dual kind of reading of everything, that we can enjoy the poems as poems themselves, but then there's the subtext of it. Just like in wrestling, people can enjoy wrestling just for the athleticism and the cool looking moves and everything, but then if you follow the psychology that drives the matches, everything like that, that you get so much more out of it. So like with your poem, like the poems in this book, they're great as poems, but then if we decode the myth of wrestling, then we get so much more. And so to me, I really liked the incantation in that I thought it served as a decoder to the reader. So I thought I'm glad that you mentioned that he gave you that advice, because we were definitely on the same page then.
No, absolutely. And we actually talked about that because it's the first poem. I mean, the first two poems of the book really explicitly deal with wrestling, but it's the first one that doesn't really mention wrestling. And it goes big into myth. Yeah. And again, yeah, that was, we totally talked about that. That was exactly it. Just this idea of opening this space and kind of teaching people how to read the book. So yeah, I'm so glad you noticed. That was awesome.
Sorry to interrupt your next poem, but do you when you watch wrestling and everything, do you take wrestling as kind of like a contemporary mythos kind of thing? Do you relate the two, like the classics myth, like, and so was that kind of deliberate association that you were going for?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the I was so excited to have Rachel and David Kirby blurb the book. One of the people that I had listed as a major influence was Anne Carson, specifically because of all of that kind of mythology and I would say David and Rachel both draw on that too, and well, I mean Matthew Dickman does too, but I mean, Anne Carson is a classicist, like,
Yeah.
you know, in the same kind of way that I was, and so yeah, I was deliberately throughout this book trying to draw connections to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Shakespeare, Chinese literature, just like across the board. Like I was trying to really just, yeah, exactly, draw that connection as kind of a modern contemporary mythos. Um, let's do Stone Cold Steve Austin's mother. So another one of the kind of through lines of the book was all of these poems about these wrestlers' mothers, because I thought, like, what better way to grapple with masculinity and toxic masculinity and all of these issues than to take these larger than life men and write a bunch of poems, fictional poems about their mothers. So none of these poems are actually true. I mean, I do not believe that Stone Cold Steve Austin's mother spent 12 hours in labor. I wouldn't know if she did. But so all of these poems about their mothers are these fictionalized accounts. They're trying to help me get at some aspect of masculinity. So Stone Cold Steve Austin's mother. She thought from the moment he was born that his head looked like a podger, beautiful and asymmetric, keen as a book of birds. She spent most of the 12-hour labor pretending she was at sea, perched in the nest of an old British sloop, the whole sky unfurled to the bleeding edge of tomorrow. Afloat in her mind, she thought of all the boy might do one day, the harm and delight, the various ports of call. Atop her three-masted ship of war, and just as the pirate queens of old, she wished him life, no regrets, all champagne and daybreak, a world of inevitable pain, good mince pie for the long, difficult years, a bit of luck, and a following wind. And so this poem, the book I'm working on right now, is tentatively titled "Songs of the Pirate Queens," and so the kind of central sequence of poems is a fictional pirate queen narrator, and then throughout the book are going to be these kind of historical fiction poems about actual historical pirate queens. And so this poem kind of foreshadows that, with the footnotes and just the mentions of these kind of historic pirate queens. Just because I like Easter eggs, and I like video games that have Easter eggs, and I like when wrestling matches have Easter eggs.
Yeah,
So I
I
like,
looked all these names up, and that was really cool.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they're really interesting. So that's what I've been researching and kind of reading obsessively lately. So,
And I
um,
love pirates, so that was to me that was like hit every notch in my uh, fascination belt.
I figure it's a good sequel to wrestling, right? I mean, if there's something more extravagant than wrestlers, it's probably pirates. So, and then how are we doing on time?
Uh, we're good. As we can kind of go over the hour if you're fine with that. Otherwise, we can just do like another poem or two, and then have some questions.
That's what I was gonna. Let's do a couple more poems, and then, because I knew you said you had some more questions, and then maybe an ending poem. Is that what you
Yeah,
mentioned at the
yeah,
start?
that'd be great.
All right. Um. So one of the other things that I knew I wanted to do with the book, in addition to have the Perry Saturn sequence kind of as the engine, is I wanted to shoot him out in outer space, in part because his name is Perry Saturn, but also because it just seemed right. I don't know. I don't have a better explanation for it. And so the first poem where we really start to head out into space is Madison Square, um, which of course plays on the garden theme that runs through the book, but also sends us into outer space and brings the mother, mothers and sons together. So this is the poem. It's in the center of the book, and it really kind of takes a bunch of these themes that run throughout the whole book and kind of weds them right in the center of the book. And that was another one of Mike's suggestions that I think just worked out so perfectly. So yeah, let's launch into space. Madison Square. In the beginning, the garden was an ice rink leased to P.T. Barnum. In 1898, Nikola Tesla demonstrated the first remote-controlled robot to Cheers, and in 1925, the first ring debuted in a light heavyweight bout between Berlenbach and Delaney. The first WrestleMania was held there too. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, the Iron Sheik. Oh, to be present for history. The roar of the crowd, an ocean on a faraway world, a palace, a grand purple desert under pale milk stars. Why do we like a fight? The spectacle, the violence on the floor. Somewhere, a mother holds her grown son for the first time in many years. She braids his hair like he is 8 again, dreams of slowing time. Somewhere, a pulsar wind nebula turns around a dying neutron star. A boy lifts weights in a garage in South Georgia, draws pictures of things he can see in the sky at night. In a garden somewhere, everything folds together. A crowd erupts at a shooting star press. A man picks flowers for his mother, fleeting and superluminal, or something beautiful, made by a boy with all his heart. Oh, I'm gonna get some water here. Do you have another one that you want to hear?
I think this one will lead into kind of the first question I would ask you. So that would be a good. It would be so good it would almost look planned.
Perfect.
But the title poem, "The Gardens of Our Childhoods."
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, the Gardens of Our Childhoods. It is a well-known fact that wrestling is scripted. Every possible outcome laid bare, gridded as a garden where our gentle, childish breaths skirt low growth of chamomile and thyme. The sun is lifted high, the whole wide world a painted hero hoisting a near vanquished foe. We sit, hands locked, knowing the ending, still watching it fall. What do you want to know about it?
So I love that one because I like to ask questions about titles, and so that one is. I have a question about the poem in particular, and then about the way you use that poem's title as the collection title. So in that poem, just talking about that poem, I love the way that you equate and link the beauty of gardening with the beauty of wrestling, and to specifically point out that wrestling is scripted, but that doesn't subtract from the beauty of it. In fact, that's all the more like gardening because we deliberately lay out the plants in there and then they bloom in the order that they're arranged, and that the beauty isn't lessened simply from the deliberation of it. So to me, I love all that symmetry running throughout the poem, and the metaphor that you found for wrestling being as gardening. What ties wrestling and gardening to you as like that apt metaphor? How did you kind of touch on that? Was there a moment when that like epiphany moment when you're like, oh, this is like that? And then a couple feet off, like what to you about wrestling is most beautiful, and what then in what ways is poetry to you kind of beautiful? So that last one's a big one.
Oh yeah, no. Ooh, these are great. So I started gardening when I moved to Pennsylvania for graduate school. And I wasn't super happy in graduate school. And so gardening was this kind of uh, coping mechanism slash way for me to be outside slash just escape. Um, and I've when I moved to Utah, I had to kind of relearn how to garden because the climate here is way different. I mean, we get hardly any moisture, and we're at like a little over 6,000 feet. um, and so we get super cold winters and super hot summers, and um, as I moved here and I was relearning how to garden, and kind of relearning to find happiness in it. And at the same time, I was hanging out with this crew and relearning how to watch wrestling, which I hadn't really followed for most of graduate school, which was 6 years. So, well, probably like really 7 or 8, because I don't think I really watched it much toward the end of college either. Um, and so, yeah, I think it was just one of those natural moments of serendipity where I was relearning how to do both of these things that were super important to me, and all of these connections just kind of flowed out from all of that.
That's awesome. I love that it turned into the title of the book, because I think it also captures the book perfectly, in that wrestling, typically most people that love wrestling now have a love for it in childhood. I'm talking about kind of older people, but yeah,
Yeah.
so there's that nostalgia that that we mine our memories, and harvest them to bring us joy and everything. So I feel like the garden itself is a great uh, conveyor of not just the joy of the relationship with wrestling and gardening, but then as a great vehicle for nostalgia and memory. Uh, for the did you think of this poem immediately, kind of as like, oh, this is a good collection title, or did you experiment with having to really find a way to categorize everything going on in this book?
I know that the title, I think by the time I had 4 or 5 poems that were kind of coalescing, where I was like, oh man, this is going to be something. The Gardens of, I mean, this was probably the third poem I wrote. And I knew that was going to be the title. As soon as I knew that the poems were kind of glomming onto each other, I was like, yep, that's it. That's the title.
And that ties into this next one, 'cause I was kind of wondering, like a chicken and egg situation here. Did you have an idea that you're like, oh, I want to write, not, I don't want to say like a wrestling book, but a book where wrestling is a major component, a major conveyor of, like you said, masculinity and these other things that you want to convey? Or did they just happen to kind of be incidentally about stuff that you've been writing about, and you're like, oh, these all kind of fit together? So I guess, was the collection a conscious movement towards that, or were you kind of already just, they were just independently happening, and then you were like, oh, these are working together?
No, it was totally a conscious movement. Like I said, when I started writing the first poems of this book, I was still finishing the last poems of the chapbook, and it was more of a direct on approach, kind of, I mean, almost confessional poet, self harm approach kind of thing. And as I started to write these poems, and as I was watching more wrestling, I realized like this is a more efficient vehicle, or maybe not a more efficient vehicle. I don't know what, that's not exactly what I'm trying to say, but this was just, I don't know, it just clicked for me, like, of course, what better way. And so I kind of wrapped up the chapbook and submitted it as a chapbook and was done with it, and was like, I'm doing this about wrestling now. Like, I'm using wrestling as this lens, and I'm going to use gardening and pull all these things in. The outer space stuff didn't come until I was probably about a third of the way into the collection, though. That one was a surprise to me. But
Because the space stuff, I was wondering, are you a big sci-fi person too? Do you like?
oh yeah, yeah, I'm
Okay.
a huge sci-fi fantasy. I'm a geek. I'm a huge geek. So yeah, and I at the time I was just particularly interested in the science around space travel, and the kind of the realities of space travel. Like, what are we going to do if we need to leave this planet? So that's where that came. That that's where that came from too. But it worked nicely because I also knew it's wrestling, man. I had to send people into outer space. I had to do something wild to end it. I couldn't just end it. Like I had to do something wild.
Yeah, so like you mentioned the Madison Square, but then also Perry Saturn becomes the first wrestler to board the International Space Station, and then we have the the kind of the closing punch here. Uh, all of Saturn and the third plutonium resettlement operation, which are great as poems, and then sci-fi because you got mathematical equations in there, scientific ones. You got scientific names for things. Did and those are sort of more narrative persona poems. Did you spend a lot of time, like you said, researching to get those right? Like how what was the kind of revision and writing process for those ones?
Um, so I did spend a lot of time researching. At the time, I was also so I play a lot of like pen and paper games and tabletop games. And at the time, I was playing a tabletop game with a group of people called I think it's called First Martians. Basically, if you think about the book The Martian or the movie The Martian, it's like that, but as a tabletop game. You have to kind of keep yourself alive on Mars, and so and it's very like scientifically accurate. And so I was kind of deep into all of this stuff at the time because we were kind of midway through this campaign in that game. Um, and so yeah, I was diving into like kind of further research about you know what happens to human bodies whenever they leave Earth's atmosphere because we don't really have any radiation shielding outside of Earth's atmosphere, and it's actually a big issue. Um, and so then, yeah, I pulled up a NASA white paper, and I actually got the real equation. That's it. That's the equation. If you want to figure out exactly how long you can stay outside of Earth's atmosphere before you get cancer, that's it.
Wow. This wasn't a planned question, but now that you've mentioned sci-fi and love of board games and everything, I know my wife will want me to ask this. Are you a are you a Trekkie?
Oh yeah, I know. I love Star Trek, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, all fantasy, sci-fi, all of it. Yeah, I am an equal opportunity dork.
Do you have a favorite Star Trek series?
Oh yeah, it's got to be Deep Space Nine.
Okay.
So I've got nostalgia for Voyager because I watched it on UPN when I was young, and it was probably it wasn't I watched TNG first, and I have nostalgia for it too. Um, but yeah, it depends on my mood. If I'm in the mood for maritime literature, I'll go with Next Generation because it's basically just 18th century maritime literature in space. And then if I want like political intrigue, I'll go with Deep Space Nine. And if I want cheesy camp, I'll go with Voyager.
I love those similes. And so I'm glad you read the poems you did too, because I actually had Perry Saturn questions and Mother questions paired up. So I'm glad you talked a little bit about that, about the the Mother poems, because you there, like you said, there are a few in here, and not just as a word, but as a setup for contextualizing. Ultimate Warrior's mother, Buff Bagwell's mother, Hacksaw Jim Duggan's mother, to name a few, that are very rich in pathos, dramatic situation, uh, getting into the interiority, like you talked about, of someone who cares for these men who are involved in a very dangerous line of work, and so maybe have to watch that masculinity present itself from the outside, and what it must be like to watch performers and just loved ones do all that. So and lots of reasons why I love those, but I love them as dramatic set pieces because I love monologue poems and all that. And you talked a little bit about the origin of that. Did you find that you loved the kind of monologue or narrative poem or persona poem, we'll say, and is that why you kept it going? And like you talked about, now you have that upcoming collection with the pirates. Like, what about that form that you kind of really spoke to you as you developed it?
It gave me a distance to kind of approach the different subject, and I would say that a lot of those mother poems are really some of the most depressing and harshest poems in the book. Um, like if you think about like Jimmy Snuka's mother, or some of these other ones, and so it gave me, writing from that exteriority gave me a distance to approach it in a way that felt more authentic. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly felt that way. So
Yeah, cause I love that, because I think you do a beautiful job of inhabiting that character. But like you said, there's also that still necessary level of detachment, because you aren't that person, and especially because you're fictionalizing it, so you do get to kind of invent some
yeah.
of the details. uh, to go more micro now and ask you a stylistic question, uh, you I like the capitalization choices you make, and a lot, and the spaces between periods in some poems are, the capitalization follows kind of what we would expect a punctuation to, but sometimes it's all lowercase. Is What's kind of your stylistic approach to way you do capitalization and punctuation?
Yeah, so we talked about this a lot as we were kind of going through revisions, and that whole process. And partially it was what felt right. Um, some of the poems didn't really need to adhere to those formal stylistic conventions, and some of them did. Um, but then I'm also a really methodical person. I mean, I'm a researcher in my day job, right? Like I do spreadsheets and data and numbers, and I'm just I tend to be pretty methodical. And so as we were doing revision, I actually spent a lot of time going through and tightening up, um, the internal conventions of punctuation. And so there's obviously, we've been talking about this. It's a braided book, right? There are several sequences of poems that are braided through, and each sequence has its own kind of punctuation conventions. And I tried to make sure, well, and with Mike's help, we tried to make sure that the punctuation was internally consistent for each sequence, even though it wasn't consistent across all of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering if you in particular, you mentioned that one of your favorites was the Stone Cold Sonnet. Do you have a particular poem that you just absolutely love in here, that I'll say, like, maybe a poem that you love more than maybe like anybody else loves it?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, oh man. It's got to be Blackjack Mulligan's mother. Would you like me to read this one?
Yes, I think we have to hear it now.
All right. I think this one's my favorite, and it's my favorite because of the pacing of it, and the absurdity of it, and the kind of bitterness of it, but also, I don't know, just everything. I just love it. It's probably the best poem I've ever written. I'll be honest. Blackjack was birthed in Sweetwater, Texas, to a rattlesnake and a baker. Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna restart that because my phone just gave me a low battery warning.
Okay.
Blackjack was birthed in Sweetwater, Texas, to a rattlesnake and a baker. Blackjack's mother taught him how to make bread, giving him rounds of dough to roll and knead. Blackjack kept his hands busy, for idle hands are devil's playthings. Blackjack's mother's name was Sarah. She made love to a snake out of spite. Her husband was a drunkard, and besides, snakes have pretty eyes, but cold and shriveled souls. Sarah kept a locket of the first woman she ever loved. She also had pretty eyes. Sarah loved Blackjack with all her heart. He was a gentle boy and large for his age. He dreamed of slender fishing birds, herons, egrets, ibis, bitterns. He saw a bittern once in an aviary in Old Laredo. It was sad because aviaries are sad places, especially in Old Laredo, and especially because bitterns breed in the marshes of southern Canada. Sarah was glad he got to see a bird, but sad that Blackjack was sad. It is a nice fact that mothers can be sad for their sons, especially sensitive boys like Blackjack, who get sad more often than most. So Blackjack would go through his life loved by his mother and sensitive, loving slender birds and bread making. He would learn to wrestle to keep his hands busy because kneading dough or muscles is basically the same for a sensitive 300-pound man. And Sarah would think of him often, and her drunken fuck of a husband, and the woman she truly loved, and the pretty eyes of a rattlesnake, and all the ways a mother singing sounds just like a bittern in old Laredo, sad and slender build, full of thick-throated longing for far-off Canadian springs.
That is a great one. I have one last question for you that we'll get you out on, and then maybe you can read a closing poem for us. And if you're open to it, I might have a suggestion for that closing poem if you're okay with it.
Absolutely.
So the last question is more of a silly one, but a poem of yours in this book that I love, and I'll read it to everybody because it's very quick. But John Cena's Spinner Belt. John Cena's Spinner Belt. Who wouldn't love such a gaudy display of in your face be fucking better? And that's the poem. That I love it. But I love it because it evokes so much for me, and it brings up a very, I feel like, contentious topic with some wrestling fans about the spinner belt itself. What do you like the spinner belt? Do you miss the spinner belt?
I miss the spinner belt. I love it. I love it.
I did love the spinner belt. I thought it was so cool.
I'll throw down with that. I love it.
I always loved the spinner belt too. I thought it was the coolest thing as a growing up.
I thought it was just great. Again, just a gaudy display of in your face be fucking awesome.
All right, so
yeah,
the last poem, and I thought it might be a kind of fitting tribute because he is your favorite. If you want to lead us out on your Razor Ramon poem.
absolutely, yeah, and this is another one that I love this poem too. So it's a great one to end on. And so the thing I'll say to preface this poem is when we were doing revisions, Mike pointed out that first M dash on that first line there. He was like, it's just perfect because it's like the toothpick sticking out of his mouth. And every time I read this poem now, that's what I think about. That M dash is like the toothpick sticking out of Scott Hall's mouth.
I do love the visual tie-in with that.
So, Razor Ramon. It's easy to say we all have choices. Sitting stoned, watching old wrestling vids and listening to Mazzy Star and reading YouTube comments about a guy who named his heroin rig after Hope Sandoval and how she never left his side or left him down for 18 years and how he has been clean since June 10th, 2016. I'm glad. It's hard to explain how even at heights, some of us can't see past ourselves. How Razor Ramon would always be the bad guy, even after his face turned, when everyone loved him but him.
Awesome. So thank you, John, for joining me. It was a great conversation. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself.
Oh yeah, I had a great time. This was great. Thank you for having me.
And so here's his book, In the Gardens of Our Childhood, which I will post a link to purchase in the description video. And for you, John, how can people get a hold of you? Where can they find you at?
JohnBelkPoetry.com. Easiest way to get me.
Awesome. I will post the link to his website as well. And if you don't mind, I can put your Twitter there too, if you're okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can Twitter and Instagram are both at Belk the Poet. So
awesome. So the link for his book, his website, Twitter, all that fun contact stuff will be in the description. He is John Belk, The Gardens of Our Childhoods. And thanks for joining. See you guys in the next episode.
Thank you so much.